The honourable gentleman who is a near neighbour of mine, and both he and I represent seats in the north of England which are not full of city slickers and billionaires avoiding taxes with expensive lawyers. Can I also pay compliment to the APPG for the work it's done on this, representing constituents up and down the country who've suffered dreadfully under this arrangement. I think it was a US Supreme Court Judge Marshall who once said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And this, I'm afraid, is a very good example of that. A tax policy that is destroying families, homes, mental health and even lives. I give way.
My right honourable friend is making an absolutely pivotal point. This is a deeply unconservative action by a Conservative government. And surely the mood of the House is clear that nobody here wants to see this loan charge implemented. It's devastating people's lives, and the government needs to act, and act immediately.
Well, he makes a powerful point. I'm not going to make a political point out of this, but I'll make a policy point, if you like. 20 years ago, when I was a Public Accounts Committee chairman, it would not be true to say that the Inland Revenue behaved like a charity. They were always pretty tough. But I have to say in the last 20 years, it seems to me that the exercise of their judgment has become more and more oriented on cash and less on justice. And that's really what we're addressing today. I think part of the reason for that... in a moment. I think part of the reason for that, and it does come back to my honourable friend's point, is that successive chancellors have blurred the distinction between tax avoidance and tax evasion, one of which is illegal and one of which is a matter of judgment. And what that's done is put a huge burden on the judgment of the HMRC, put too much of a burden on it, and so we see them effectively making the law through their judgment and making the law in ways which are deleterious to our constituents. I give way to Honourable
my right honourable friend is making a very powerful case around how the tax system is developing, but also the issue of justice. Would he agree with me that there are a number of people in this situation whose employers came up with these schemes and they had no choice but to sign up to these schemes, and in some cases have left the employment of these companies for decades and are being pursued for the funds, but the employers can actually wash themselves of the whole thing. So it is not just, it is not fair for them to be pursued retrospectively, but also to have signed up to schemes over which they had no choice if they wanted to be employed by that company.
Well, he's absolutely right. It's a point I'll come back to in a second, but it also rests on this point of judgment. How does an ordinary lay person forecast what HMRC will decide in 10 or 20 years' time?
Exactly.
And we see this, and unlike others, I'm not going to butter up the Treasury bench today. We see this even in the responses of ministers in previous debates, and even in the letter we received from the Financial Secretary this morning, who talked about the reason for the definition of this scheme. He talked about this for the sole purpose of avoiding tax. Well, I have news for the House. I've got at least a couple of ISAs which are there for the sole purpose of avoiding tax. Are they now illegal? Is that the criterion we should apply? Well, plainly not. Plainly not. So there is a real issue here about the approach of HMRC, and I'm going to be rather harder than the APPG in terms of my recommendations. I think they're being just a little bit too reasonable, and I'll come back to that in a second. Come back to that in a second.
Never been reasonable.
A number of my colleagues on this benches, I think, are threatening to sue me for calling them reasonable. But before I come to my point. On my main point on this, I want just to go back to the report carried out by the House of Lords Committee on this subject. Now, we have all got very emotional cases impacting on our judgment in this. But you can't say that about the House of Lords. The House of Lords looked at this incredibly dispassionately. They don't have constituents, and so they can be viewed, if you like, as much more dispassionate in a way than us on this. So let me just remind the House of a few of their findings. They found that the Public Bill Committee for the Finance No. 2 Act 2017 did not adequately scrutinise the loan charge. Now, that's incredibly important. It's something that's going to be retrospective. They didn't properly scrutinise it. It was actually just spoken about, I think, by the Minister and the opposition spokesman. I think nobody else in that. They said many witnesses have told them that they joined these schemes, this is my honourable friend's point, without being aware of HMRC's attitude towards them. Many were assured by employers or promoters they were above board, and indeed, as he says, they couldn't have had the jobs if they didn't accept the terms, which is why we find not city slickers, not bankers, not finance specialists, but nurses, I'm afraid not, nurses, doctors, locums, care workers, all caught up in this. People who will never have the resources to pay back this money, never have the resources. Doesn't matter if it's 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. They'll just never have it. And many witnesses also said they declared the schemes to HMRC. Yes. Now, this really is the criminal aspect of this, that you declare a scheme and then 20 years later or 10 years later they come back and say, sorry, we haven't closed your year, you can pay now. And you can pay not a small amount, but £20,000, £30,000 in the case of some of my constituents. Now, the committee found, and it says here, and this is very important, because again, where does the blame lie here? I think part of the blame lies with HMRC, but part of the blame lies with the employers. And many people have said that's where the HMRC should focus its effort. But the House of Lords Committee found little evidence of action taken against those who promote disguised remuneration schemes. They went on, HMRC seems to be prioritising the recovery of tax revenue over justice, and that's the point which is central to today. The committee noted that the people involved here were unusual subjects of this sort of recovery, and because of the nature of their employment and so on. And then it goes on to say that, of course, these disguised remuneration schemes are unacceptable tax avoidance, but it also said the loan charge is, however, retrospective in its effect. Now, this House was formed in order to challenge the King in his day on the justice of taxes he was demanding and put their own concerns back to the King to get them corrected before we paid the taxes. And we shouldn't forget the fundamental reason for this House's existence, to look after our constituents in the face of demands from the state. Now, it also made a recommendation that HMRC should make clear public statements in future when it's looking at avoidance schemes, because of the fact so much the burden of decision falls on them. They should make it clear to the public at large and anybody in those schemes when it's investigated. I'm afraid not. I've got a couple of minutes and I'm going to come to an end in a second. So that's the House of Lords view. It was very, very critical. For a House of Lords report, it was an incredibly critical report. Now, let me just turn to the issue of the motion and the APPG's approach to this. And as I say, it's incredibly reasonable. Let's have a review, the judge-led review and whatever. Let's take some time and get this sorted out. I'm afraid I think that's altogether too reasonable in the light of the pressure that's being created by this policy. People who are under this policy now are suffering mental strain day in, day out. They are not people who are ever going to find £20,000. And to say to them, you've got 5 years to pay, if you are, as one of my constituents is, on a minimum pension, is meaningless. It just means his house is going, or his car is going, and his family is breaking up under the strain. So my view is very simple. This should not be retrospective at all before 2017. At all. Because there's no reason for it whatsoever given the behaviour of the HMRC. Right. And if we do not get something like that, then I say this to the Treasury, and they can add this into their accounting for this. I will at least, and I suspect many others in this House, will start to pursue a right in law for every citizen that limits the extent to which the state, and particularly HMRC, can take any retroactive action whatsoever against persons, not against companies, not against the Vodafones, but against individuals. Because it seems to me that we owe a duty to our constituents to have some certainty from the state in the taxes they pay.
I'm going to have to reduce the time limit to 7 minutes. Sir Edward Davey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I
apologise to the right honourable gentleman member for Halton Price and Howden for being the chair of a group that's produced such a reasonable